Mount Lu, or Lushan, has witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, ministers and generals. It has played host to great writers and historians, and it has been a place where Buddhist and Taoist masters have sought seclusion. But Lushan was dominating the local landscape long before the first human ever set foot on its slopes. During the greater part of the year, the peaks of Lushan are veiled in mist and drifting clouds, giving the impression of a heavenly paradise. On clear and sunny days, by contrast, one verdant peak after another can be seen, and even the deep valleys that run among them. Since ancient times, this mountain has won the hearts of heroes and artists with its charm. It has also witnessed many great historical events. However, its history extends much further back in time, to long before humans first arrived here. At the Lushan Fossil Museum, the ancient rocks and stones are silent witnesses to the mountain's birth. One afternoon 3 million years ago, a multi-bed beetle might have been seen basking in the sunshine on a large rock. A billion years ago, the area was covered by a layer of silt and shallow seawater. It would in fact take several shifts of the Earth's crust before the land emerged from beneath the water. During the Himalayan orogeny of 20 million years ago, faults began to appear in the Earth's crust. Where there were fissures, the surface was forced upwards and mountains appeared. "3 million years ago, the Ice Age descended on the area and the Earth began to tremble. Huge ice crystals appeared which pushed heavy rocks and small pebbles alike down the cliffs. The long dormant glaciers were waking. The phenomenon is known to scientists as the Quaternary Glacial Movement. For millions of years, beneath the glaciers, subterranean currents flowed. These would eventually transform nature above. new species of taller vegetation began to cover the mountains and fields. The valleys became wider and flatter as streams and waterfalls coursed through them. Today, here and there in the mountains, there are still remnants of the Ice Age.
喜马拉雅运动，我们可以把它，或者是这个第4纪冰川运动，把它叫做这个雕塑家这个粗模型，就像这个甩泥巴一样，建好了一个粗的模型。这个粗的模型是管它叫。最后呢，由于这个地质环境的演变吧，咱们这个庐山地区的气候变暖，这样的冰雪融化，最后这个几万年以来的这个流水作用啊，又细细的打磨了这个粗的模型，使它这个地质景观越来越美丽，形成了咱们现在庐山的这个美貌的景观。
Mount Lu rises above the lower reaches of the Yangtze River. It's an area favored by nature, with rivers, lakes, peaks and valleys, surrounded by low hills. For generations, the people living on the rich and fertile land here have prospered. Historians have confirmed that human activity began in the Lushan area during the late Neolithic Age. When the human race was still in its infancy, people here began creating a colourful world of fables and myths. Many of these stories are still told today. The most widely known of the ancient tales is about Kuang Su. In the 5th century BC, Kuang Su came to Lushan in search of the secret of immortality. The king, however, wanted him to return to court, but Kuang Su declined. The king sent men to fetch Kuang Su, but they couldn't find him, only his hut. Lu means hut, and Shan of course means mountain, hence Lushan, or Hut Mountain. An alternative name for the mountain is Kuang Lu, or Kuang's Hut. There is some dispute over when the name Lushan was first recorded. The great scholar Wang Guowei discovered a book written sometime between the year 475 BC and 221 BC. It reads, "The king made a southern tour as far as Lushan at Jiaojiang." However, one name more than any other is associated with the ancient history of Lushan. He is an historian from the Han Dynasty. Mount Lu, or Lushan, has witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, ministers and generals. It has played host to great writers and historians, and it has been a place where Buddhist and Taoist masters have sought seclusion. But Lushan was dominating the local landscape long before the first human ever set foot on its slopes. In the year 126 BC, a young man arrived at Mount Lu. He'd come from the Central Plains and was on a philosophical pilgrimage. From the top of the mountain, he looked down on the Jiaojiang River below and reflected on the legend of how it had been dredged by the legendary leader Da Yu, or Yu the Great. 30 years later, the visitor wrote of this experience. "I climbed Mount Lu and gazed on the Jiaojiang that had been dredged by Yu the Great." The writer was the great historian Sima Qian. He recorded his impressions of Lushan in his classic Records of the Grand Historian. Today, on the main peak of Mount Lu, there is an historical site called the Dayu Terrace. There are also steles and inscriptions commemorating the legendary hero. Mount Lu was fortunate in being introduced onto the stage of history by such a great historian. Sima Qian and his Records of the Grand Historian made the mountain a center of enlightenment. In the year 220 AD, the Han dynasty fell after 400 years in power. With that, China entered another period of division and unrest. Amid the internal conflicts among rival kings and the foreign invasions, the remnants of the old Han regime were forced southward. By the early 4th century, the center of Chinese civilization had shifted south of the Yangtze. The migration continued for the next 2 centuries. Despite being written about, Lushan was still little known. However, the southward expansion of Han civilization created a chain reaction that would lead to the mountain playing a central role in Chinese history. On Mount Lu, there are no less than 900 rock carvings. Many of the vigorous characters and beautiful texts are records of great people and events. There's a gorge on Mount Lu called Scissors Gorge. Those who look carefully may see a portrait here carved into the rock face. The rock has been steadily eroded over the course of many centuries, but even so, a sitting Buddhist monk is still discernible. But who was he, and why was his image carved on a rock in Lushan? For thousands of years, the Eurasian continent has been home to herders and farmers. Where they have come together, there has sometimes been conflict and sometimes mutual development. 2,500 years ago, far away in the Ganges basin, a religion came into being and began to spread eastward. By the 4th century, Buddhism had been in China for 300 years. By then, the imperial family and aristocracy had been converted to Buddhism, but the approaching cavalry of the northern nomads made a much louder noise than the chanting of sutras. In the year 378, an army 100,000 strong laid siege to the city of Xiangyang in what is today Hubei province. Inside the city, the monk Dao An was urging his disciples to flee to safety. He spoke to them each in turn, giving them instructions. But when one of them, Hui Yuan from Shanxi, came to bid him farewell, Dao An said nothing. When Hui Yuan asked him why he was silent, he simply replied, "A man like you needs not my instruction."
慧远很难过，他就跪在地下跟道安法师说：“他说你把这些师兄弟呀都安排了，你没有给我安排，是不是我是一个最糟糕的弟子，所以你不管我？” 这个道安说正好相反，他们必须我做安排，但是你有你的前途，而且是很了不起的前途，不是我安排的，是你自己做的。
Today, in the many places of worship on Mount Lu, people express their faith in the same simple way that their ancestors did. For 2,000 years, the Buddhist teachings from the distant subcontinent have been reinterpreted and reformed in the course of being incorporated into the indigenous Chinese culture. As a result, Buddhism became more accessible to ordinary people. The idea of karma, the desire for universal peace, and the importance of family harmony have taken root in the Chinese psyche. The origin of this change is Donglin Temple. Otherwise known as the Founders Temple of the Pure Land School, it stands at the foot of Mount Lu. The founder of the Pure Land School was Hui Yuan. In the late spring of the year 381, an itinerant monk might have been seen walking along a path on Mount Lu. He had left Xiangyang 3 years before, and he had been wandering ever since. He had come to Mount Lu to visit the abbot of Shilin Temple, his old friend Hui Yong, who, like him, had been a disciple of Dao An. Thus, as if it was predestined, Hui Yuan encountered the great mountain.
从前学佛的人跟道家的隐士，他们都不愿意在这个红尘扰扰的世间，所以就往乡下山里头跑。所以尤其是许多这个古代的高僧啊，入山唯恐不深，因为大家追踪他们呢，所以他们越跑到深山里头去，所以觉得呢，我们就秉承了天下名山半属僧。
Mount Lu, or Lushan, has witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, ministers, and generals. It has played host to great writers and historians, and it has been a place where Buddhist and Taoist masters have sought seclusion. But Lushan was dominating the local landscape long before the first human ever set foot on its slopes. As a newcomer, Hui Yuan visited all the scenic spots on the mountain. Historical records state that he would often venture deep into the valleys to meditate while listening to the sound of the springs and gazing at the rocks. A poem he wrote goes, "Who can soar into the air without beating his wings? I see the truth with such clarity that I know more than Confucius taught." Hui Yuan came to understand that the sudden enlightenment he experienced was superior to the self-cultivation practiced by Confucian scholars. A 600-character essay he wrote called On Lushan is acknowledged as the first literary description of the scenery at Lushan. The poem and the essay reveal how the peaks and waters of Lushan purged him of his earthly thoughts. Hui Yuan decided to settle on the mountain. The local magistrate became a great admirer of Hui Yuan, and in the year 386 he had a temple built in his honor to the east of Shilin Temple. The new temple was named Donglin, and Hui Yuan would spend the remaining 36 years of his life there. Historical records describe Hui Yuan, before he became a Buddhist monk, as a learned and wise Confucian scholar. The chapter on him in Biographies of Enlightened Monks states that as a young man, he studied the 6 classics, and in particular knew Laozi and Zhuangzi. However, at the age of 21, he was converted to Buddhism by Dao An. Up until the 7th century AD, the language used in India was Sanskrit. The period from the 3rd to the 6th century AD saw many of the Buddhist scriptures introduced into China. However, the language they were written in was mostly incomprehensible to the Chinese monks, but translating them created its own problems because the different interpretations created considerable confusion. Huai Yuan's response to this problem was to send his students to study Buddhist teachings in India. He also invited Nepalese, Indian and Chinese monks living in Chang'an to Lushan. There, under Huai Yuan's supervision, they translated the Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. In fact, of 700 Buddhist scriptures rendered into Chinese during the 200 years from the 3rd to the 5th centuries, a full 1/3 were translated at Donglin Temple. Huai Yuan was also concerned that Buddhism, despite being present in China for 300 years, remained outside the mainstream culture. Most Chinese people still regarded Buddhism as an abstruse foreign religion. Huai Yuan opened up a new path. He blended elements of the prevailing Chinese philosophies of Confucianism, Taoism, and metaphysics with the foreign religion of Buddhism. As a result, Buddhism, as he reinterpreted it, became more accessible for people from all social strata in China. This process has subsequently become known as the Sinicization of Buddhism.
"佛法进入中国呀，之所以能够成为中国的，在古时候成为国家的一个文化呢，因为佛法的理上非常了不起，非常深奥，有智慧有学识的人很欣赏，以研究佛法为光荣，觉得佛理非常入世，那么可以上比我们中国原来的儒家道家，所以他要研究它。那么同时呢，他在世上呢又迎合了人民的崇拜，可以求福报平安的希望，所以一个外来的宗教成为中国3大文化之一，一定有它的道理。所以我们谈儒家道家之外，我们不能够不知道佛家倒是谈些什么。而在佛家之内最普遍的，可以也说理入又事入的，那么这个最好的呢，就是说净土宗。
During his 36 years at Donglin Temple, Huai Yuan reinterpreted the Buddhist idea of karma in the light of Chinese culture. He explained that karma exists because the spirit is immortal. This idea has a far-reaching influence even today. Huai Yuan preached that true Buddhists would be transported to the Pure Land in the West after their death. This was the origin of the Pure Land School. As a way of expressing his own devotion to Buddhism and spreading the Buddhist message among others, he and a group of Lushan hermits formed the White Lotus Society. Hence the alternative name for the Pure Land School, the Lotus School.
那个时候，这个慧远的影响就移至到了西域，今天的阿富汗呢，甚至包括了伊拉克这一带，以致了有了这么个说法，那边的这个宗教徒啊，对庐山呢要行之起手大礼，心献如月， 也就是以头触地来崇敬庐山。
Under Hui Yuan's guidance, what was originally an Indian religion was infused with elements from Chinese culture. In other words, he laid the foundations for the Sinicization of Buddhism. Since then, Chinese Buddhism has had two holy sites, one in the north and the other in the south. The northern site is Chang'an, where the great Indian Buddhist monk and translator Kumarajiva dwelled. The sacred site of Buddhism in the south is Lushan, where Hui Yuan lived. Hui Yuan passed away in the year 416. He was laid to rest beside Donglin Temple. Lu Xiaojing had arrived at Lushan in the year 461. But long before Lu Dongbin came to Lushan, Lu Xiaojing had already established it as a center of Taoist belief. No one can say for sure just how many people came to Mount Lu in search of seclusion over the centuries, but there's one point of general agreement. The greatest of them was Tao Yuanmiang.